Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and support the channel on Subscribe to our locals and buy me a coffee. Now, today we have a special guest, José Niño from Niño Speaks. So for those who don't know who you are, Jose, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I am a writer on geopolitical and even like domestic affairs. I write for various outlets. My main gig is actually at Headline USA as an editor there, but I do cover a host of topics ranging from immigration restriction, geopolitics, and Zionist influence, like the United States, among other issues. And I'm originally from Venezuela. I came to the States when I was relatively young. My family brought me here like 98 or so. And I have covered Venezuela before, not as much as now, in light of recent events. But I have a unique perspective on it from watching it from afar, just looking at some of the dynamics that have taken place in Venezuelan history over the last 50 years that I think separates me from a lot of commentators, both like not just like in like Latin America, but also in like Western world. So I try to add a fresh perspective on that, especially in the last 6 months with the military buildup and then the eventual Delta Force raid. I felt that I had to like get back in the game and start talking about that because I really didn't cover Venezuela much from like 2019 up until 2025. I covered it every now and then, but now I've been mostly focused on that and providing a perspective on those issues.
All right, well, glad to have you here. So the first question comes from Keith Preston.
Yeah, it's widely argued or speculated that one of the motivations for the U.S. action against Maduro.
I don't think Keith is here with us. It sounds like.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Hello?
I can
is
hear
Keith
you.
Keith here?
Yes.
I can hear Keith.
Yeah. I cannot.
Yeah, we can hear Keith.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so go ahead and ask my question.
Yeah, so it's widely speculated that one of the reasons for the action against the Maduro regime was to curb the influence of the major Eastern powers like Russia and China in the Western Hemisphere. And the Venezuelan government under Maduro was known to be friendly with those. And parallel to that, there's a widespread speculation that there may have actually been an arrangement between, say, the United States and Russia, or even the United States and China, where America would agree to roll back its operations in Ukraine, and in return, Russia and China would cede Venezuela to the American sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Do you see any evidence for these particular claims?
There is some validity to the effort by the U.S. to keep China and Russia out of the Western Hemisphere, especially in Venezuela. This is there's like multiple variables behind this action. I would stress, though, that Russia's involvement in Venezuela is mostly for defensive weapons. It sells a lot of defensive armaments, and they just don't constitute an offensive threat to the United States or even some of the countries next to Venezuela as well. And they just don't have that capacity. And there's also no real evidence to that, as well as China. There's going to be like the establishment of like a military base or like a military alliance where the Monroe Doctrine would be invoked. So I think those type of rationales are overemphasized. Yeah, the U.S. would ideally like to decouple China and Russia from countries like Venezuela, especially China. I say China, the economic challenge in Latin America is bigger, but that strikes me more as like a trade question, not so much of a military issue, because most of South America now is increasingly interconnected with China. As far as the arrangement, a backdoor or room arrangement between Russia and the United States, where they would have like a sphere of influence type of geopolitics, I'm skeptical of that, but first off, there's no real smoking gun for obvious reasons. And also, the U.S. is still providing intelligence to the Ukrainians against Russia. And in my opinion, the U.S. foreign policy right now is more recalibrating, where they're going back to Latin America to kind of reconsolidate and also just push back against any Chinese influence and try to tie up some loose ends as well with regards to resources and forging nearshoring and friendshoring agreements to prep the U.S. for the eventual near-peer and peer-to-peer competition that's emerging against these Eurasian powers. But I don't think the U.S. is going to like a Pat Buchananite, much less a Ron Paulite type vision where it's going to be reducing its military presence abroad. It's just retooling its strategies. It's probably going to rely more on like special forces raids, proxy conflicts, the use of contractors, and it's also going to try to find new trade partners, not just in Latin America, but also countries like Vietnam and India for nearshoring or just reshoring from China as well. But I think that the U.S.'s like imperial pretensions are still there. It's just they have to recalibrate their capacities because it's very overstretched. And I've argued that a lot of the financialization and deindustrialization has also affected the U.S. military-industrial complex. And as a result of that, U.S. strategists have had to reorient the U.S. grand strategy to be more Latin American focused and also look for other countries in the global South to partner with for basic resources and to create like a new like ad hoc globally integrated system that's more U.S. friendly.
Okay. The question that I have is the night, I guess, that Maduro was captured by Delta Force. The thing that I thought was strange from both the reporting and the video footage was that it appeared that the Venezuelan defense forces stood down. There's no indication that, at least I could tell, that their defense forces, like their anti-air defense forces, their jets, or even some rumors about Maduro's bodyguards, were actually fighting or contesting this Delta Force entrance. Now, I've heard rumors that there were people on the inside who just looked the other way. Is there anything to that?
Well, there is now some evidence coming out, and I was listening to some special forces channels that cover these type of like operations, these hidden hand operations, that the U.S. was able to kind of use like an Assad strategy, like in Syria, where through sanctions and eventual bribes, that they were able to flip several members of the Venezuelan intelligence apparatus and the military to the point where it would cause enough disruption in communications and just also effectively create like the environment for like a stand down order to prevent any meaningful resistance. That's what I suspected, in my opinion, was that they were able to use these type of hybrid warfare tactics of sanctions and intelligence penetration, because apparently they were able to get enough intel from flipping not just these military people, but also high-ranking members of Petróleos de Venezuela, the state-owned oil company, to get information about Maduro's pattern of life and what he was doing in his day-to-day affairs. And that's what, to me, explained this really bizarre incident where really the disproportionate amount of casualties that occurred were actually of Cubans that were in Maduro's security detail, because there is significant Cuban involvement in Venezuelan security affairs for just the simple fact that they have proven counterintelligence capacities. They're also very good with proxy warfare and have experience in that, and that's why he's lended to that. I also suspect, too, Maduro knew that he couldn't really trust even people on the inside of Venezuela, because for the last few months, it has come out, and this has been speculated before, and it's been largely confirmed, that there has been a consensus emerging within the Chavista establishment, if you will, that Maduro had to go, but it would be on a more protracted timetable, like say 2027 or 2028, but they were already talking about this transition away from it. I think the Americans caught wind of that, and they just said, okay, we already know that these people are already talking about post-Maduro future, so we're just going to accelerate this timeline. And that's what I suspect happened, because there's a multitude of factors. And if you talk to a lot of Venezuelans, because I have a lot of contacts that in like academia and even former military that have said, like, since about 2018 or so, there have been grumblings in Chavista media outlets and among figures that have exited the government, like on bad terms, that these people are still like pro-Chavista, but they don't see Maduro as a guy. So you had this really weird intersection of interest where the Chavista establishment and like the U.S. kind of became strange bedfellows.
Okay, the next question is from Alec.
Yes. My question is as follows. Now that Donald Trump has vowed to manage Venezuela and run it as if it were a colony, is there any actual evidence that Venezuela will comport to the values that Donald Trump purports to have? For example, is Venezuela likely to become more democratic or market-oriented, or is it actually going to be managed by the new Chavista acolytes, the new Chavista politicians who will preserve status quo with some token allegiances to the United States? Jose, do you see any fundamental changes in the cards, or is it going to be business as usual?
I think your last point, the last point you put out there, is largely where it's going to go. So if you look at the reaction from neoconservatives and neoconservative adjacent pundits, whether it's Elliot Abrams or John Bolton, they're actually starting to become disappointed with the fact that even though Maduro was snatched, the Chavista security establishment and the overall political architecture is still intact. However, Delcy Rodriguez is an interesting figure because those who don't know her background, when she first got into politics, she had a falling out with Hugo Chavez, and she didn't come back into the fold until Nicolas Maduro was first elected in 2013, and she worked her way up the establishment. And even though she does come from a pretty radical background, her father, for example, was arrested and tortured to death in the 1970s by the Venezuelan security services, which at the time, that was when Venezuela was a bit more pro-United States. She has shown a degree of pragmatism when it comes to economics. And even the Maduro regime, too, in the last decade, has gradually been moving in a state capitalist direction. They've been relaxing currency controls and some price controls here and there. And one factoid, too, when Venezuela tried to apply to BRICS, they got rejected for two reasons. First off was the Biden administration at the time was able to put sufficient pressure on Brazil to veto it. And Brazil also had its own concerns that Venezuela was just not doing these reforms fast enough to at least have like a nominal like state capitalist economy that moved away from the 21st century socialist model that it had. That was pretty redistributionist in nature. And what I expect with Delcy Rodriguez is that they will play ball with the U.S. on certain investment opportunities and even likely give more favorable concessions to American oil companies who right now are actually very hesitant to invest in Venezuela for many reasons. Mismanagement there with regards to the oil sector, a lot of like updates that need to be made for the regulatory framework there. But I think they're willing to play ball with certain companies. However, on the democratic transition, I expect the Rodriguez and her cohort to drag their feet on that. And that's one thing that has angered many Venezuelan commentators in the diaspora and neoconservatives in DC, that they are actually correctly suspecting that you're just going to see a more recalibrated form of Chavismo. And I think that in the ideal world of some of these people, like the Delcy Rodriguez and some other pundits that have kind of come out lately being cautiously optimistic about Rodriguez is that they think that Venezuela is probably going to move in a more like Vietnam or Chinese type of state capital model.
All right. The next question comes from Florida.
Yeah, hi, Jose again. Thanks for taking our questions. So one thing that I haven't seen much discussed was what actually Ramsey Paul raised like a couple days ago. That was that the U.S. picked up Maduro because Venezuela wanted to sell oil not in dollar denominations, right? So what significance do you think does the petrodollar have, and keeping the petrodollar up? What role did that play to the U.S. approach to Venezuela, to the capture of Maduro and so on?
I think it may have played a role. One problem is, though, with regards to Venezuela's oil commerce, because this is also connected to China, is that even though the majority of Venezuela's oil exports do go to China, China is not much of a Venezuelan oil importer. If like they were completely cut off from that, China would probably be pivoting more to Russia or even some of its partners in the Middle East, like the Saudis and other countries, because they have excellent relations with not just like Iran, but also the Arab oil producing states. And I think there's a whole like constellation of factors that prompted this maneuver to get rid of Maduro. But I think that a lot of it too is U.S. wanted to get back on the scoreboard, and Venezuela was the weakest link, smallest country, least militarily advanced, and it's right next door as well to the U.S. And if you listening to a lot of these pundits, whether it's Elliot Abrams or whatever, it was a good way to get rid of the Iraq War syndrome, just like in the 80s that Reagan got rid of the Vietnam War syndrome by invading Grenada and Panama as well. And I think that played a big role here in terms of like the strategic importance of Venezuela. I think it is a bit overblown because Venezuela still actually is very connected to the U.S. in terms of trade. It does not have any military facilities that could cause like a Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's why I think some of this stuff it's an interesting war game scenario once like we're fully in like a multipolar world of like potentially these countries could set up bases there in response to the U.S. encroaching in their or extending themselves in these countries' respective domains. But I don't think right now there's much evidence to show that Venezuela poses that much of like an existential threat to U.S. And also the way that they did this whole Delta Force raid of keeping the Chavista government intact. I that's also a sign they just don't see Venezuela, like the Venezuelan state, as like a major threat. And they're just what I think the U.S. wants is to kind of just retool some of these business dealings and just make sure that that Venezuela doesn't become like a launch pad for other like subversion operations that say Russia, China, or other extra hemispheric actors will use it for. But I like I said, the relations that China and Russia have with Venezuela, they are not in any way, shape, or form like very harmful to U.S. interests. They don't even have much of a offensive military capacity to begin with.
Okay, I'm gonna read a super chat here to break it up a little bit. For $5 Michael Hassler, thank you very much. Recommend reading On the Essence of Legal Consciousness book by Ivan Ilin. Thank you. The next question is, if there were elements within the both security forces and political apparatus of Venezuela that wanted to see Maduro go and stood down, do we have any idea who they might be?
That is actually a really good question. Historically, Venezuelan coups, like military coups, tend to come from like mid-level officers, and you have to go through that, those type of people. And I also suspect there are elements of the business class too that were involved in this. And going back to Delcy Rodriguez, she has been more business friendly. She was able to get sanctions relief with people with NATO and EU countries that outside of the US, and was able to somewhat normalize. There are a lot of people who actually think Delcy Rodriguez was likely in on this, and that's been a narrative that has actually been hinted at by the New York Times and other outlets, that they think that she was the one. But there's not much concrete evidence to point to that, but there is, from a cui bono's perspective, that she and her faction, like her brother Jorge Rodriguez, who runs the National Assembly, have much more power now. The other people, big players like Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, and then Diosdado Cabello, the Minister of Interior. Especially Cabello, he's been a Chavista loyalist from the start. He was like involved with Hugo Chavez during his 2 failed coup attempts in the 90s. And Padrino Lopez himself is largely a loyalist, but my opinion is that they may have gotten some other people underneath them to just flip and cause enough chaos to allow for this operation to happen. And there's also a cyber attack as well that the US was able to use successfully during this attack. And this combination of factors did lead to this successful raid happening without very little to no casualties on the American side.
Okay, the next question comes from Alec. You with us, Alec? Okay, in that case, the next question is coming from Florian.
All right. Yeah. I think we brushed on China a little bit already, but how big is Chinese involvement here really? I mean, people have speculated that the Chinese-based defense infrastructure that Venezuela had, they just failed in preventing Maduro's capture. So how big was China's involvement in Venezuela really, if we go from a defense point of view? How much strategic assets did China deploy to Venezuela? How big is their involvement really?
China's involvement is more economic in terms of investments in infrastructure, refineries, and other economic activity. In terms of defense, it's actually not that big. Russia is more of the supplier of defensive weapons and other armaments there, and conventional weapons, but China is not very involved in security affairs with Venezuela. I would say they're more of an economic partner, if anything, and they have played a more significant role in the Venezuelan economy thanks to the U.S. maximum pressure sanctions campaign against Venezuela in the first Trump administration. But I do not regard Venezuelan-Chinese relations as overly militaristic whatsoever. In fact, I think it's largely exaggerated. Even the Russian case, it's very much in the defensive terms when it comes to basic defense. It doesn't pose like an offensive or strategic threat to the U.S. or its allies in the region.
Okay, the next question comes from Keith.
Yeah, recently the Isaac Accords was introduced, where there's an effort to build relationships between certainly Argentina and also Israel. And it appears that more efforts of this type are in the works. For example, the newly elected president of Chile has become very outspokenly pro-Israel. We've seen evidence of Christian Zionist influence in a number of the Central American countries, El Salvador, Guatemala. The U.S. favored opposition leader in Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado, said that if she were to become president, she would move the Venezuelan embassy to Jerusalem in Israel. So the question is, to what degree is the action against Maduro motivated, at least in part, by Zionist influence over American foreign policy in Latin America and the goal of strengthening the relationship between Israel and Latin American countries. After the incident happened, Delcy Rodriguez herself denounced what happened as far as the capture of Maduro as a Zionist action against Venezuela. So to what degree is that true, and to what degree was this a motivation of the particular action?
It plays an underrated and under-discussed role because you mentioned the Isaac Accords, which is part of a broader push since the election of Javier Milei in 2023 to make Latin America and even the parts of the global South safe spaces for Zionist and Jewish supremacist interests in these regions. And this is a dynamic that is now really going into effect in Latin America after October 7th because of just how unpopular Israel has become. And especially among Western European and even just the broader European and white world, because even the US, there are trends pointing towards Israel becoming very unpopular. And even among young white evangelicals, they're losing support. So what has happened is Israel, it has been cultivating new bases of support among brown and black evangelicals from Guatemala all the way to countries like Kenya and Nigeria. That's where they've found new bases of support. And this stuff did not happen overnight. It is multiple decades in the making. For example, Guatemala was one of the first countries to recognize Israel in the late 1940s and had plenty of security cooperation with Israel during its civil war from the 60s to the early 90s, where the Israelis provided military advisors and weaponry to Guatemalan security forces to carry out harsh punitive actions against indigenous rebels there. And other countries like Colombia, for example, Colombian paramilitaries and the military alike have received consistent military support and training from Israelis. And there's even Israeli sellswords like Yair Klein that have been involved in drug trafficking in Colombia with the likes of Pablo Escobar. And he's also trained Colombian right-wing paramilitaries there. So there has been involvement, and Guatemala is instructive because in Central America, the rise of evangelical Protestantism and other sects like Pentecostalism is on the ascent, and to the point where it's already surpassed Catholicism there. And even in countries like Brazil, it's also growing really fast. And this trend is playing out as well in Africa to boot. And it helps in Africa's case that they have also Islamic movements that are on the rise. So it creates like a strategy of tension where the Israelis can exploit to grow their influence. So a lot of right-wing politicians now in Latin America, a way to get street cred among not just Tel Aviv, but also the U.S., is by signaling their support for Israel and just Zionism. You see this with Maria Corina Machado, who was actually in 2012 only got like 2% of the vote in the primary elections, presidential primaries, but now has become like an international star. And there are plenty of other candidates and presidents that have done that same strategy. Like Daniel Noboa in Ecuador is a committed pro-Zionist. And also in Colombia now, there is a dark horse candidate that many people think could pull off, who's an independent named Abelardo de la Espidea, that codes very right-wing, but he's also gone out of his way to go to many of these groups, Jewish, Zionist, Israeli groups, not just in Colombia, but also in South Florida and Miami, which has become a new power base for Zionism, world Zionism, to curry favor with those people and also signal to the U.S. that he's willing to play ball. And I think this does play an underrated role in Israeli influence operations to not only repair its image in the global South and Latin America, but also for resources as well, to get resources, because Israel is a state with very limited strategic depth, and it's also very reliant on the U.S. as a security guarantor, not just for its like defense, but also shipping and a lot of other logistics to get resources. And they, in many respects, a case could be made if you're going to use the oil argument, like this war is about oil. The country that has more need for oil in this instance would be Israel, more so than the U.S. need for like Venezuelan oil. But the issue, I think, with the oil argument that I would stress is that Venezuela's oil industry is been on the back foot for a while. It's been mismanaged and also very expensive, low quality oil. So it's going to take years, if not like a decade or so, for it to get back online. But there are a multitude of factors why Israel has taken an interest in this. And also, for one thing too, Venezuela is a honorary member of the Axis of Resistance since Hugo Chavez was elected, because Venezuela has completely shut off all ties with Israel and has aligned itself with Iran. Has been a really strong ally of Iran. They've worked in not just the oil sector, but also for defense cooperation in terms of drone technology. And the Venezuelan regime has also been an ally of Hamas and Hezbollah, and that has alerted numerous Iran hawks in U.S. over the years. So they have taken an interest in it. They're definitely playing a role in terms of like the hostile narratives towards Venezuela. I wouldn't say they're the only actors or the precipitating reason, but they have played a role in trying to justify some type of action against Venezuela. But the Isaac Accords are definitely a big thing to be looking at, because a lot of countries now in Latin America, they're going to be judged by like their diplomatic actions and other security affairs with regards to Israel. If you look at next door of Colombia, I mentioned how historically it's been the U.S. as in Israel's most reliable security partner in Latin America until 2022 when Gustavo Petro was elected. Colombia has taken an unprecedented turn with regards to Israel. They broke diplomatic ties with Israel, condemned it for October 7th. And I have argued that is what has led to the deterioration of relations, not just with Israel, obviously, but also with the U.S., because you've had people during the Biden administration like Deborah Lipstadt, who gave Gustavo Petro a tongue lashing for his criticism of Israel and his downgrading of ties with Israel. And it also didn't help that Petro was playing footsie with China with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives, because Colombia has historically been more integrated with the U.S. It's one of the few South American countries that's not fully plugged into the Chinese trading network too. And that's one thing, like the U.S.'s like security strategy is in Latin America to look at the Israel ties, also the China ties. If those countries take antagonistic postures towards Israel in some shape or form, they're going to be be put on notice, whether it's through sanctions, tariff threats, and other punitive measures, and also for forging too close of ties with China as well.
All right. The next question comes from Alec.
Yes, Jose, my question that I was wondering about is what is probably the most important for the geopolitical future of the 21st century. What's next? Are we seeing a precedent in the kind of regime change that utterly supersedes what George W. Bush may have planned? You see, the Iraq War was extremely unpopular for obvious reasons. Too many lives lost, too many soldiers lost, too many crimes against humanity, too many disasters, though Donald Trump apparently found a way to extract Nicolas Maduro. What's next? Is he going to try this in Gustavo Petro? Is China going to try to one-up him? Is Vladimir Putin going to attempt something similar somewhere, perhaps in the Middle East or Southeast Asia? Does this carry implications for the war in Taiwan? Do you see this as a game changer for how regime changes will take place in the 21st century? And is this how Trump will make his political brand going forward? And how will this influence the behavior of other state actors in the future?
Well, with regards to Gustavo Petro, I think that the U.S., because Colombian elections are coming up soon, later this year, they're probably just going to wait it out because for all intents and purposes, the Latin American right is on the ascent across the board. And the U.S. doesn't even really need to do an elaborate extraction with him. They can prop up like a guy like Abelardo Espinilla or any other figure there to just win. And they have a history of winning. And the Colombian right the center right has largely dominated politics there throughout the Cold War up until 2022. And many countries in Latin America now, they're exhibiting trends now that in this fully democratic era, with the exception of obviously Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, that they can go back and forth between left and right. I mean, before Milei, they had Alberto Fernandez in Argentina who was like a pro-BRICS guy, Peronist, and then went to Milei. And even before Fernandez, they had a guy, Mauricio Macri, who was a very pro-Zionist, pro-US type of neoliberal candidate. So they don't always have to use military action. They can use like hidden hand operations, influence operations, even the use of proxy armies, if you will, because that's the thing too. The US has become more reliant on special forces. I think this is like a theme because of the fact that these type of black operations, like Seth Harp, for example, is noted, they tend to be lower casualty and also done in a plausible, deniable manner that doesn't get as much international or domestic backlash, at least at first. So they're probably do that. As far as precedents being established by this, it's hard to say because we've already seen a breakdown in a lot of the international order with annexations and separatist movements that have been fostered by, like, for example, the U.S. in the Balkan Wars with regards to the unilateral independence movement of Kosovo, and then the Russo-Georgian War with regards to Abkhazia and Ossetia as well, and then obviously Ukraine too. That I think the latest events here just reinforce the fact that the international order is just breaking down in general, and we are seeing the return of more like hard power politics. And with regards to the nation building, that might be over because it's so costly and expensive and just stretches the resources. But the U.S. is definitely going to try to get back into the game once it's able to reindustrialize or at least stitch up like a new global network of like nearshoring and friendshoring, if you will, so that it can compete in this game. Because one of the big themes we're starting to grasp, especially the Russo-Ukrainian war, is that a lot of conventional warfare is still very much intact, and you need to have like an industrial base to carry out conventional wars, and that you can't always use these lightning fast operations to shape geopolitical outcomes. They're not like a silver bullet that can be used in certain contexts, but to really remake the world in your image, you're going to have to go back to the basics of like grinding attrition warfare. And when you have a highly financialized system that not only deindustrializes you domestically, but also in terms of your military, you have to eventually go back to the basics of like reshoring, or at least setting up like an industrial like supply chain with other friendly nations to meet your military needs.
All right, we have some questions from the chat. Lucky Lou 7373 says, "Hello, Jose. What would personally consider yourself as in a philosophical or political sense? I've seen you on AA and was curious to ask." I think he means, what school of thought are you?
I'd say I'm more of like a third positionist, if you will. I generally favor like a kind of a mixed economy of sorts, and a state that proactively like fosters like strong industry and clamps down on financial capital. But I'm a realist on foreign policy. Like the ideal type of foreign policy I'd have would be much more restrained and Yeah, I believe like in like an organic national state as well that preserves like the founding stock of like its state building people, and I would like that model ideally replicated in multiple countries. But yeah, that's where I tend to land on these days, more of nationalist, if you will.
All right. We'll just call him Brandon. Asks, what is the chance that America goes to war with Iran during Trump's second term? I think that's what everyone is concerned about right now.
It's definitely, it'd be, in my opinion, it's going to look like an air war, because one thing is to note as well, the United States tends to prefer a lot of these decapitation strikes or hidden hand special forces type of operations, and also anything involving air power. It seems that there is an aversion to boots on the ground, at least for now. And that's what I think it's going to look like. If there's going to be another conflagration with Iran, it's going to involve some type of air war, in my opinion. I think that the ruling class knows in the U.S. that there's no stomach for these long, drawn-out wars where you could have like thousands of casualties on the American side, but they can still massage, they can still try to thread the needle by doing color revolutions, using contractors or proxies, special forces, and precision strikes and decapitation measures to carry out U.S. imperial objectives in a way that's not going to promote backlash. I don't foresee like a massive invasion of Iran, though.
So would that be fair to say something like Serbia in the late 90s?
Yes, that is very much in their toolkit, and I think they're going to probably do that for the time being, in my opinion.
All right. Matrix Invader asks, has nation building ever worked?
I mean, you could probably point to like Japan, Italy, and Germany after World War II, but those countries beforehand were already pretty developed, regardless of what you think about the governments that ran them. And you weren't really always like they were like completely obviously devastated, but you weren't starting from scratch, both like just like in terms of physical infrastructure, but also human capital either. There was still a ton of talented people that were on the same wavelength, more or less. So it's not like you're doing this, let's say, in the Middle East or any other country that has just a totally different culture, racial stock, and everything. You can't really impose those type of values that easily. And that's the thing, too, with the flaws of universalist models, is that just because these projects ostensibly worked in Europe doesn't mean they could work in the Middle East or other civilizations. And those countries in Europe that were like destroyed militarily, they still retained a lot of their cultural and all that institutional knowledge they built. So it wasn't like they were like starting from like zero. I mean, as far as like the culture and like human capital is concerned, obviously the infrastructure they had largely build that from scratch. But as long as you have like that human capital and institutional knowledge, you can even that can get a country back on its feet, regardless of like the circumstances they go through.
Okay. CD13 asks, are there Hezbollah bases in Venezuela? And if so, why do you think they were not attacked by the U.S.?
There has been Hezbollah communication and some emissaries that have gone to Venezuela over the years. Strikes me more for for advice on potential like asymmetric warfare operations in the case of their like a conventional invasion by the U.S. or by a U.S. controlled government in Colombia or Brazil. In the case of constellations aligned there, to teach them like urban warfare and other forms of asymmetric warfare. But I don't think there's much evidence of like bases there of like a big military presence. This has been amplified a lot by the Iran hawk set in the interventionist establishment. They try to point to some Hezbollah agent or emissary going to Venezuela as proof that there's like a base being built. And they try to make a mountain out of a molehill regards to that, but it's not much evidence of that. It's very much diplomatic, and also I would argue like defensive. There's no evidence that they're being used as basis to launch like offensive operations across Latin America, much less like the United States.
Okay, Lucky Lou 7373 also asks, what was your political journey like?
Yeah, I started out more as a conventional Ron Paul libertarian when I first got into politics. I was actually very involved in Republican Party politics for a time on a host of like single issues. But over time, I've become much more of a nationalist, and these days, I do retain like the like non-interventionist foreign policy inclinations I've always had. But on economics, I've become more of an advocate of like state capitalism, and I'm also much more in favor of like immigration restriction and generally oppose the neoliberal consensus. But yeah, that's my journey is very similar to many people on the like the so-called dissident right or the nationalist spaces, where I did start out as kind of like a conventional libertarian Republican and have become more nationalist over time.
Well, all right. You had mentioned before the show that you have an hour limit, so I think we'll put a bookmark in it here. And why don't you tell people where they can find you? And
Yeah, my articles, you can find them at Headline USA, Occidental Observer, and then I have my own Substack too, José Niño Unfiltered, josealnino.org. Head there for my articles, and also my podcast El Niño Speaks is there, as well as Apple and Spotify and YouTube too. So you can catch my interviews, written content there. That's where I'm most active at as far as the written material and podcast material. And then on X/Twitter, I'm Jose Al Nino. That's my handle, and you can follow me there as well.
all right. Well, thank you, Jose. It's a pleasure having you on. I'm sure we'll have you on in the future.
No, it's a pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation, guys.
Great. And thanks again, Keith, Florian, and Alec. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.